right, so we did a video not that long ago about is it lessons? And one of the concepts we talked about in that video was the idea of parasitic design, which parasitic design is a term that Mark Rosewater coined that basically just talks about mechanics that just want to hang out with themselves. But that's not how parasites work.
Yeah, we don't like this word, and we really want to advocate for a different word. The problem is that in our 15 minutes of going to thesaurus.com looking for another word, we haven't found one that's better.
Well,
there's one
that's great.
There's a really great word.
There's one that describes it perfectly.
Fantastic word.
It's like a group that only wants to be with each other and no one else.
Right. Like a family.
Like a family that only wants to be with each other.
Yeah.
Ever.
Right.
And make more of that family together.
Right. But not with other people.
Not with other families.
There's probably a word for that.
It probably.
Distraction makers.
We thought we would expand upon that idea, sort of the pros and cons of this style of design.
We speculated that this is possibly a good design move for Wizards to make as the card pool has become a lot larger. They need some way to help manage the meta in a way that they can actually design for. So we're not sure if this is going to be the future, but we're seeing maybe some early signs with, is it lessons? Is that lessons?
I love how you corrected yourself for getting the wrong.
Well, you said, is it? You said, is it earlier? And I was like, ew. But I didn't make, I don't know. I didn't want to cut you off.
Sure. So let's go through just real quick and review what parasitic means.
So parasitic design is essentially mechanics that require other specific cards in order to activate usually powerful effects. So most recently with the Zet Lessons, we saw this with Accumulate Wisdom. You have to hit a certain threshold of having 3 lesson subtype cards in your graveyard before you get its full effect.
A few other examples of parasitic designs of the past are things like the mechanic Corrupted, where your cards are powered up if your opponent has a certain number of poison counters on them. Another one would be the Ripple cards, which it sort of works like Cascade, but it only works if you hit another card with the same name as that card. So it's like probably the most parasitic design that maybe Wizards has ever done. And then finally, we have the Burst cards. There's a cycle of bursts that are more powerful based on the number of other bursts of that type you have in your graveyard.
There's a possibility that Wizards is actually looking at other games for inspiration right now to see how they've solved it, especially games that have eternal formats, because Wizards is constantly having to evolve their design philosophies to make up for Commander being the most popular format while also having to maintain Standard that rotates out.
Wizards especially is finding themselves now in an environment that they're not used to being in, which is in Standard format with a very large card pool.
Right.
Most of the Eternal formats in Magic have been secondary, and you would filter the cards that end up in those formats through Standard, and so you haven't had, the Wizards hasn't had to design or figure out a way to solve this kind of problem. They already had a system in place that would do it.
Right. So it makes sense if they have to go to other sources and see what other games have done. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is kind of the one that we bring up most often on the channel, in that Yu-Gi-Oh! Does have an Eternal format. Like, they've got a huge card pool, and they use a combination of restricted cards, banned cards, limited cards, etc. But they have archetypes. Archetypes is essentially their way of solving the queen problem and saying, like, you can play Pot of Greed as one of the most powerful draw spell cards, but you have to have a Blue Eyes White Dragon in play or something like that. And so by limiting things to these archetypes, it allows you to have the most powerful things, but with these specific limitations to make sure that one archetype doesn't just move to be the top of the food chain. And Bandai Namco seems to do this pretty often with its games. I think they are using games like Yu-Gi-Oh! as a starting point, but they see some of the issues of this archetypal design. So Digimon does this fairly often, usually by attaching it to a specific Digimon type. So it's like Agumon that has the Digivolution line from Agumon into Greymon into Metal Greymon, etc. Because the flavor, they want that to be consistent, oftentimes they have cards that it's the Agumon or Greymon like archetype line. So it's a lot of cards that end up referencing those specific Digimon in that Digivolution line, meaning that you're more than likely just getting the payoff if you only play those cards within that specific line.
And there's sort of a difference here with Digimon and Pokemon in that, like, Pokemon base Pokemon have to evolve into a specific other Pokemon, where Digimon doesn't work that way.
Right. Digimon decided that they're breaking some of the flavor a little bit, and that, like, you can take any rookie Digimon and digivolve it into another champion or whatever. So it breaks it a little bit. But it offers more versatility. It offers more deck construction as a possibility, but mechanically they're very tied to whatever those synergies are.
It seems like the trade-off there with Pokemon is that Pokemon you have to tutor a lot to make sure that you're getting those and making those evolutions be worth it. I guess classically, original Pokemon meta, most of just the base, like the best base Pokemon ended up being really powerful.
Yeah, it was like Electabuzz and Hitmonchan, I think, were pretty much the meta because the strongest basic Pokemon. You didn't have to try and evolve into anything.
Like 30 years ago or something. Jesus. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about pros and cons specifically of this type of design. So one of the big things that we've already sort of touched on is that if you're going to use the sort of like archetype specific design, it helps you to balance a meta easier, right? When your card pool is so large, you kind of have to figure out a way to know that there's only going to be a subset of cards that will be the best cards in the format. And you can do that through like power specifically. But if you're able to sort of with sort of a parasitic / archetypal design, you can limit cards' power based on their context rather than just being individually powerful cards. And like Accumulate Wisdom is the perfect example of this in that by itself, Accumulate Wisdom is a decent card, right? You look at the top 3 cards, you put one in your hand, instant speed, costs 2. That's a pretty strong card in the history of Standard. But then when it's played in the lesson context, it is much more powerful in that it's 2 mana, instant speed, draw 3 cards.
Normally, this would be some sort of a trade-off where you have to sort of limit your deck creativity and you have to restrict yourselves to only using these specific subtypes. However, in the context that we've seen with other games like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Digimon, etc., that's sort of been their barometer for power level, right? Where Magic, I think, traditionally has almost designed this as something that lowers the power level of your deck, where things synergize much better and it feels nicer because you're seeing those synergies, but it's not going to be as powerful as a deck that just has that one specific strategy or plan.
Yeah, and we'd see this most often with like tribal decks like elves or goblins, which have been successful competitive decks in the past. Specifically, goblins and fairies are the ones that immediately come to mind. Elves a little bit too with like Elf Ball, but usually those aren't great. They're sort of B, maybe A tier, but almost never S tier. And then seeing something with a sort of lessons archetype, like we're seeing the emergence of this being, one of the more powerful decks in the format.
So it's either that this was done intentionally or this is something that just potentially fell through the cracks as they're developing these sort of synergies.
Another thing I want to touch on real quick with this type of design philosophy is that it's not necessarily an entire deck that's being designed. It could also be packages of cards. Some of the more popular packages from the past would be something like Reanimator, where you're running like Entomb and then you're running Reanimate, or it could be something like Brainstorm plus like Fetch Lands. And then that sort of package can be put into different shells so that you have a deck that is a culmination of several different packages. And we see that with the most recent Reanimator deck that basically just got banned out of Legacy, but it was because it was combining a very tight Reanimator package plus a really tight Tempo package. And those two together were extremely powerful, and also you're able to pivot between the two game plans. So when we look and extrapolate that to the Lessons deck in Standard, we can see a Lessons package, but we can also see a Prowess package that's being put in alongside of it. And those two packages together work really well because Prowess cares about spells, and Lessons obviously cares about lesson spells specifically, but still spells. So you get something like Storm Chaser's Talent slotting into this deck very easily.
Not literally that every single card in this deck is just a lesson and plays lessons and gets payoff for them. Ideally, you have enough of that payoff, like you said, of non-creature spell benefits or something like Storm Chaser's Talent, and get the payoff from that with the combination of the fact that it is a lesson spell.
We can also see this because there were a lot of different Izzet decks that were good in at the World Championship, but they were all sort of like playing different packages of things, right? And it happened to be that this Izzet Lessons deck playing the Lessons package, the Tempo package with Storm Chaser, or the Prowess package with Storm Chaser's Talent, and then also playing Monument to Endurance happened to work in such a synergistic way that it ended up being the most powerful deck. But those individual packages are still designed in this kind of parasitic way. Let's get back to the pros. Because they're sort of designed in this more parasitic, self-connected way, it's a bit more obvious to newer players that these are things that they should combine together.
Right. If you open up in a pack, and I think they talk about this, right? Like the as fan. I think that's kind of the same description that Mark Rosewater uses for that.
And as fan meaning
as you fan out the cards.
Yeah, as you fan out the booster pack.
Mark, I love you, but you need some better terms here. All right. I get as fan is stuck, but come on.
The frequency. It's
frequency.
It's
the frequency that you're running into these cards. But if you end up reading enough cards that end up referencing lessons, and you see lessons as a subtype, it makes, new player brains go, oh, I should put lessons in my deck. And like, if you start doing that, you'll probably see some synergies. It might not be the most optimal version of that, but you at least get that feeling of what it's like to see synergies start to happen.
And in a way, this is similar to like the tribal decks of the past, right? Like, oh, I like dragons. I want to put dragons in my deck. Oh, I want to put all the spells that care about dragons in my deck. We mentioned this before, but the sort of dragon, Golgari Dragons deck that was also pretty successful at Worlds, and that cares about having dragons. We can take that sort of tribal idea and turn it into now a sort of package idea that doesn't really necessarily care about individual creature types. It instead cares about spell types.
The final pro that we have here is that it's just ludo-narratively satisfying. So when you're opening up your... we'll use Strixhaven, because I don't think lessons are super great with the Avatar set. It's not like super tied to Avatar, but...
He's learning how to airbend.
Whatever. When you open up Strixhaven packs, and you end up seeing lessons, and you get excited for Wizarding School Magic set, and then you want to play a bunch of these lessons, like, that feels good being the player that got excited for that specific narrative and theme, to then be able to play those cards out in a way that feels effective.
Well, I think especially connected to Universes Beyond, right? Like, if a player is going to choose to like come into play Magic from the perspective of, oh, I really like Avatar, and then they can see Avatar represented all the way to the highest levels of the format. So cons, why is this a problem?
One thing is that it, potentially limits player creativity when taken to, I think, an extreme. The more that this is a reliance on deck construction, the less opportunity players have to put any individual card in one card's place.
The other big problem is that I think the idea of this is that you're basically just conceding to the fact that the meta is going to be solved really quickly, which, look, in today's day and age with the internet, that is possible, is that metas are being solved much faster. So you could just say, okay, well, we're just going to assume that it's going to be solved pretty quickly, and then we're going to force the end state of that meta, and then we're going to balance that end state, right? In that we're going to shortcut players to what the best things are by making them sort of prescriptive and parasitic in this way, so that players find those archetypes easy. The cards and the packages that are there are much more powerful than not playing any of these packages. So then we can effectively limit the card pool down so that we can balance that card pool again, but still have the I don't know if I want to call it an illusion, but we can still have the plausible deniability that the card pool is much larger than maybe it seems.
In doing so, you technically can still, it's almost in an artificial way, but you can plan for a diverse set of decks. And there's still going to be things that designers can't plan for exactly. Once it's in the hands of pro players and thousands of players, like, there's going to be things that you can't see. But I think that is like the other potential problem that could be considered, which is that if there's anything that falls through the cracks here, it's potentially a much more dangerous thing than when you had a less tight restricted archetypes for your card pool. And what this is like, if you're planning for all of these archetypes, let's say you want a healthy 5-deck meta or something at the top, and you get a diverse set of strategies. If there's one card that didn't get accounted for or planned for, or players use it in a way you didn't anticipate, suddenly one of those 5 decks is now shooting to the top, meaning that you have even potentially a much more unhealthy meta than if deck creativity and construction was still open and players felt like they had that opportunity to theory craft their way into beating the top deck still.
And, previously when we had a smaller card pool in standard, it was a lot easier to kind of like set a baseline and stick to, okay, we're going to have some sets that come right up to that baseline and other sets that don't, or different aspects of different sets were at that baseline. So you'd have like, maybe the creatures in one set was close to the baseline, so that set was really good with creatures, and then another set the spells are better or something. And so when those cards are combined into a singular meta, you have like, okay, here's all the best creatures and all the best spells, but they hit a particular baseline still. It's just that this set was better at one thing and this set's better at another thing. But when your card pool gets too large, you sort of like run out of space for that. And so you always have something somewhere shooting past that baseline, and that just ends up being the best thing. And I think that is the problem that Wizards kind of keeps finding themselves in, is that without like an additional system of entropy that keeps players from playing the best stuff, the stuff that shoots past that baseline is just going to be the best.
At least even just a shorter rotation, right? It kind of helped alleviate this at least a little bit.
It's limiting the card pool.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is kind of where decks might end up going. We're seeing this a lot in the industry in general. It wouldn't be a shocker if Wizards started tightening this down in order to get a handle on Standard. So what is this in comparison to how decks were designed previously?
In the past, that baseline thing that I was talking about, where some things would come right up to the baseline, but there was still like a cap, right? Like nothing would even like lightning bolt in the format was like that's like a really high baseline, right? Like so usually Standard would be a shock format, or it would be a lightning strike format or something, right? Where are your cheap burn spells doing 2 damage or 3 damage? It's hard to know how much of like the metagame that Wizards could see at any given time. You had sort of like power outlier cards that could like define archetypes. Things like Birthing Pod or Astral Slide or like the Bitter Blossom, these cards that were like powerful sort of enablers of particular strategies, but the shell in which they would exist in, I think Bitter Blossom obviously is like, okay, it's going to end up in fairies probably, but it didn't have
not
to
necessarily.
Right. It gives you a 1/1 flyer every turn for 1 life.
It didn't rely on fairies.
Right. It's really good. Even like just engines for card advantage, like Greater Good or Phyrexian Arena, these cards that were like, they're not prescriptive in how you're going to use them, right? It's like, we're giving you card advantage. You decide what you want to do with that card advantage. And that would lead to just sort of like some really, interesting creative deck ideas. I mentioned Astral Slide, having a really particular, obviously a particular engine that wants you to be cycling cards, but then the rest of it, it's like, well, what creatures are you blinking in and out of combat? Like, that's up to you. Obviously, you want things that will have a come into play effect, but one of the best creatures that was played in the deck was Exalted Angel, and it was because it had morph, so you could morph it into play, and then you could blink it with Astral Slide, and it comes back in face up.
And Astral Slide is kind of interesting because, like, technically it has some of that parasitic design in that it requires cycling of cards, and cycling at that point I don't think was quite evergreen or used as often in sets.
The Onslaught is when that mechanic was like brought back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, but what's interesting about that, at least, is that it relies somewhat to be activated by the cycling, but it's an open-ended enabler, right, in strategy. And so it's much different if instead it were, well, it's some sort of an ability that you can blink unelf, right? Because then it limits the card pool of you just looking at, well, what's the best elf to be blinking? And even then you're just probably looking at, right, stuff like more for ETBs or whatever to get the most value out of that.
So when I'm reminded of the lesson mechanic, in order to sort of make it less parasitic, I think about the type of mechanic that it is. It's a barometer mechanic, so it's measuring something, and it's just measuring lessons, where the sort of original barometer mechanic Threshold was just measuring number of cards in graveyard. It didn't care what type of cards they were. But you could, you have things like Delirium that measure the different card types in your graveyard, but something like Lessons, maybe it's not the right perfect flavor, but it could just measure number of instants and sorceries in your graveyard.
There's a difference when you end up seeing something like Threshold or Delirium, where it sort of invites like an inquisitiveness and a curiosity of how you're actually going to get that effect. In Lessons, you generally know how you're going to get that effect, right? You're going to find probably the cheapest lessons. Like, you technically could do a self-mill. Like, you could do some sort of a mill strategy if you want, if that's going to be effective.
I think it's also interesting because they're instants and sorceries, they go to the graveyard immediately, right? There isn't like a hoop to jump through. It's not like it's a creature that then has to go to your graveyard.
Right.
So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, obviously the more open-ended way to do it would just be to count instants and sorceries in your graveyard.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know. I mean, off the top of my head, that's probably just the easiest way to open it up, but it doesn't quite get the lesson part of it exact.
You're trying to get the flavor of a lesson?
Yeah, I'm trying to get like lesson flavor, but also retain the barometer, but then also keep it more open-ended. Right?
I see. Yeah, I mean, I guess it could be a threshold mixed with like a delve or something, right? Where it's like you exile 3 instants or something, and then you get an effect. And
Yeah.
so that way, it's more of fulfilling the lesson.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So it'd probably
Yeah.
be like a kicker or something. So you cast a thing,
Yeah.
but if while casting you exile 3 things, 3 instants or sorceries, then you get an additional effect or something.
Sure.
Maybe, I don't know.
I think you want it to be on cast, right? If you're trying to maintain sort of like the spell package that they're trying to connect with. So I
Sure.
like this idea of you cast it, exile. Maybe it's just a certain number of instants or sorceries from your graveyard,
Yeah.
like Murktide Regent. Gets more powerful. You exile a certain number of instants or sorceries, and it becomes more powerful. Like you use that as more of just like a kicker-esque mechanic,
Right.
for lessons.
Yeah. Could see that. It's certainly more open-ended when you do that. Yeah. And I think that's what's interesting about it, is that when you offer it just lessons, you're limited to that card pool. So it's not that there's not creativity. Someone still had to go through and theorize and consider, okay, all the lessons in this set, what are going to be the things that's going to make the best package for this? But it gets you to that answer a lot faster when it scrunches that card pool, as opposed to opening up to the entirety of the card pool in Standard for instants and sorceries and thinking, well, out of all the instants and sorceries, what's going to potentially synergize with this better?
You're right. It doesn't limit the card pool in that way to make sure that things aren't going to be super broken.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's tough. Interesting. Well, there you go. That's probably how they got the lessons.
Probably. And again, it leans towards their decision making for potentially doing archetypal design, is that they obviously, this is probably way too late in development that they didn't see VV Cauldron, but that could have happened. A Nadu situation happened, right? Like all these different cards keep kind of slipping through the cracks. So instead, they're like, no more cracks. Instead, lessons, and we know where the lessons are. They're in this and Strixhaven,
Right?
And that's it.
Well, and it might be a matter of like, well, let's limit. Right now to like get Standard back under control, and then we can start experimenting again. But we need to like make sure that we can manage 3-year Standard at all, and just make sure that we can make it good. I think that's the problem of where we're at right now, is that it just keeps being broken. So, all right. So takeaways. How do we feel about this this design strategy generally? Maybe even for our own design philosophies, I guess.
Yeah, I think as long as at its core you're still making sure that there's enough interpretation and creativity for players to experiment, I think that's really important to keep people engaged and interested. You want to, we talked about this as you have, what is it, refiners and what's the other
Innovators.
one? Innovators and refiners.
Yeah.
And people that innovate with decks, that's something that they really enjoy, and they like finding that innovation, and it helps shift the meta. But if you don't have anything that rewards that, then a lot of people that are into that deck theory are just not going to be interested.
Well, you're shortcutting the refiners too, right? Because you're basically saying like, yeah, here's the package. It's right there. Which packages are you putting together to make the deck? And then that's it.
And it depends on how big the packages are, right? In a 60 card deck, if let's say 40 of those cards are just associated with your archetype and the rest are just going to be for lands, like you don't really have much to consider.
And the thing that's weird here too, right? When we look at like limited design, like these sort of archetype slash, they'll have like signpost uncommons that like point you in a particular package direction for limited, but limited has its own systems of entropy that work differently than like standard constructed does.
It's almost better to have synergies in limited because of the unpredictability of how you open things.
Exactly. And so that you can like have a direction with how you're drafting, and also like, okay, well, I'm going to collect the cards that fit with that package and then put that together and make the best version of that deck that I can in that draft. But the entropy is there in that I don't always get the best version of that deck.
What's funny is that there's this interesting tension when you have some sort of a parasitic design within a set and you're drafting it, is because the more you get of that, the more you are beholden to making sure that you're getting more of those cards. So you have to hope that you're going to run into enough of those cards that it's going to make up for you picking these up. And I think recently the most parasitic of this was Say Its Name from Duskmourn. And Say Its Name required you to have 2 other cards named Say Its Name.
And also the thing to find.
And with thrice,
which is like just never going to happen.
Technically, on its own, it was like fine at milling, but ideally you'd also get at Altanach the Thrice Called as well.
Altanach or whatever, yeah.
Yes.
Which I guess, look, if you're going to try to make that happen in limited, you're going to get Altanach first, right? And then go, oh, well, let me get these Say Its Name cards after that, potentially. So, funny enough, to go back to the sort of parasitic examples we had earlier with like Ripple. I remember drafting at my local game store during Cold Snap. Yes, I'm that old. And one of the other players there was like trying to live the Ripple dream. He's like, I'm going to do it. And he literally drafted every copy of the Ripple burn spell, and it worked. It was insane. So like when you got to live the dream, amazing. But most of the time it just wasn't going to work.
That's how I feel when I see like a really good uncommon or something when drafting, and I'm like, I want to get a ton of that in there.
Yeah.
It's very powerful when you can have more than 4 copies of a card in your deck until it doesn't work out.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess to wrap things up for me, the important part here is that if you're going to be designing for like these archetypal packages, whatever you're going to call them, this parasitic design, that you have some other way to curb how easy it is to get to the most optimal strategies. And I realize that like with constructed play, the meta is solved so much faster now that like relying upon rotation probably isn't a good enough system of entropy anymore, that we might need some kind of innovation in this area that could just make it so that somehow you're not going to have access to all of the best stuff always.
Right. And because we don't talk too often about entropy and negentropy, I think as a good example of entropy is like, this is where deck building games, I think, really started to flourish, is a good source of entropy is when you don't have access to the full card pool, or there's something preventing you from having access to those cards.
It's basically just a system that forces you to play suboptimally in some way. Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think probably not it's not impossible in a TCG, right? Decks are already offering that as a form of potentially having to play suboptimally. But Marvel Snap does a very good job of this, actually, by having 3 territories in the center that then change how you might want to interact with those territories in a given game. That in itself is a form of entropy.
That there's a random factor that you must adjust to in every game that could do it.
Yeah. So that's all Wizards have to do. Just make us play. You know what? Let's have 2 territories in the center, and then we move our units into the territories, and then
you could like bind the rifts.
Right.
If you bind
because that's
them,
what they're called. They're called rifts.
But then when they're bound, then you win the game.
Well, no, if you hold it.
Right.
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 You need 7 points, and you got to hold it.
Or you get both.
Or you got to get both rifts. If you capture both rifts, then you're bound.
To win.
Yeah.
Bound to win.
You can steal that idea, Wizards.
It's totally original.
If you enjoyed listening to us talk about parasitic design and why it might be creeping into your Magic game, please feel free to give us a little like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below.
If parasitic design is creeping into you, go see a doctor. Also, you can join our Discord. Links in the description. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Bye.